thank you, Simon, and thank you, Evelyn, for organising this and for everybody showing up to the book club. Really appreciate it. Natalie is the author of the book, The Fiddle. Some of you may have already read it, and it's an incredible book, actually, in my view. And I am a producer. I run a production company, a small production company in London called JoeJack Entertainment. And I read the book and I took an option on the book to try to get it made into a television series, which I'll tell you a little bit about later. So listen, without further ado, let's now just go over to the lovely Natalie, who will talk you through this in a little more detail. And over to you, Natalie. I'm going to stop and let you take over because it's so moving that when you hear that violin. Over to you, Natalie.
Always cry.
And it might be good if you're not used to Zoom, you can go on to view and you can just do speaker, so you'll see Natalie in the full frame, as it were. So if you could do that, you'll get a better view as opposed to just the little screens. So Natalie, over to you.
Right, I'm privileged to be with you today, as the story I have to tell is an important one, and one the world should never forget, about what happened to so many millions of people during the last war. Not just to the Jewish race, but to countless other innocent victims as well. The Nazis did not merely wish to punish or kill, they wanted to rob the victims of their dignity, humanity, and identity. And that is why I decided to write my book, The Fiddle, and I'm flattered that it has now been published. The book is about a violin, which has been the most important thing in my life. My family survived because of it. The people who cared and protected it suffered, but the violin was still cared for by my grandfather, my aunt, my father, and now me. He went on the journey with the family and suffered with them, rejoiced with them. They gave their lives, but this was not in vain, because the violin continues to play beautiful music, despite suffering serious damage at the hands of the Nazis. Its heart enabled it to survive, and the memory of it being played by my father will stay with me forever. He urged me to write down everything he and my aunt told me about their lives, and the fiddle is the result. As a young girl, aged about 9, I met my Aunt Rosa for the first time in the summer of 1947 in the school holidays. She'd finally been sent home to my grandmother's house in Leeds after spending many months in hospital, first in Germany and then in England, suffering from malnutrition and TB, which she had contracted in the 3 concentration camps where she spent the duration of the war. We spent many hours talking together, and sometimes my father would come up from London to visit, but mostly it was just the 2 of us. She wanted to tell me about the ordeal she and many others had suffered during the war, and constantly stressed that I should never forget what she was telling me. My brain was like a sponge, and I remembered everything, probably because most of it was so horrific I could not erase it from my mind. She knew she was dying and was determined that her story was at least told to someone, even to me, a child. My grandparents, with my father and 2 aunts, great uncle, his wife and 2 children, had fled from St. Petersburg the day after the Tsar and his son were arrested on March the 15th, 1917. My grandfather was employed as violin tutor to the Tsar's children, and so was in great danger from the Bolsheviks, as well as persecution as a Jew. After a warning from the palace that they must leave the city, the whole family of 9 set out with a handcart and what possessions they could carry to begin their journey to Minsk, where they thought they would be safe. Fortunately, the worst of the severe winter weather was over, but even so, they braved blizzards and sub-zero temperatures before the spring finally arrived. What little money they had was soon spent, and it was only the kindness from some of the villages they passed through that they were able to survive. Sometimes my grandfather and great uncle were able to do odd jobs to pay for food. And on most of these occasions, my grandfather would play his violin and entertain the villagers, in a small way, repaying them for their help. After a few weeks of walking, they reached the outskirts of Minsk, where they met a group of women and children fleeing the city. Their husbands, sons, and fathers had been murdered by the soldiers, and they warned my family not to go there, for they would be sure to receive the same fate. Instead, they headed for Lvov, but again were faced with danger there, and so continued to walk, a walk of 1,000 miles, which took almost a year of hardships. The 5 children had gone barefoot for much of the time, and all the family were looking very shabby and undernourished. My great aunt was taken very ill during the summer months, and it was only with the kindness of complete strangers in a village they managed to reach that she regained her health. Finally, they arrived at Odessa to be faced with several hundred other Jewish refugees, all waiting at the docks, going wherever they could to escape certain death if they remained in Russia. For several days they waited and were given sparse rations by the authorities, just enough to exist on, but were grateful for whatever was handed to them. They talked and chatted to those around them, and grandfather would bring out his violin and play music to help keep their spirits up whilst they waited for a boat during those dark days. One day, a port official came to my family and said that a ship was sailing for England, and the captain could offer them a passage if my grandfather would entertain his fare-paying passengers by playing in the evenings. Obviously, he agreed. The family were overjoyed, hugging and kissing each other, the children jumping up and down, knowing they were going on a boat at last. They gathered up their belongings and headed for the jetty. There was the boat. The name on the side was Shalom, our word for peace. When they finally reached England, the family settled in Leeds, all together in one small house. Uncle Nathan was a tailor, so was able to cut down old trousers and coats to make smaller garments for children. The women made Jewish food using a barter system, and grandfather got a job as a kitchen hand in a cafe. During their long journey, Rosa and my father had not played the violin very much, as their own instruments had been left behind in St. Petersburg. But grandfather now insisted they practice again using his violin, and soon they were both as proficient as they had been in Russia. Rosa was always the better player, but it was my father who won a scholarship to the Royal Academy. Girls did not apply for scholarships nor travel to London in those days. My father was at the academy until his 16th birthday, during which time his father died, but the whole family insisted that he finish his studies. From there, he joined the Halle Orchestra and later branched out into the more popular world of show business. My aunt was playing with the London Philharmonic Orchestra when in 1936, she and several other members of the orchestra were invited to join the Berlin Philharmonic in Germany. She was very excited at this opportunity, as this was a chance to gain much more experience. At first, she was very happy, sharing an apartment with 3 other girls. But by 1938, conditions had started to deteriorate very badly for Jewish people in Germany, as we know. She knew she must return home when her contract ended at the end of the year and wrote home to tell her mother the news. Sadly, on the night of November 9, 1938, Kristallnacht as we know it, she was arrested as she arrived at her apartment, bundled into a truck with several others and taken to the railway station. After many days in a cattle truck in freezing winter conditions with no food or water, the train arrived at Mauthausen concentration camp. Many in her truck had died on the journey, but there were still several hundred men, women, and children from other trucks who were marched into a huge courtyard where they huddled together to keep warm. They'd been brought here to work. They were made to strip and their own clothes taken away to be replaced with a selection of ill-fitting and well-used shabby clothing, together with boots or shoes, almost always the wrong size. Each day, the soldiers stood guard whilst the staircase of death, as it was called, was constructed. The camp commandant, called Cyrus, would come to inspect the progress, but in the freezing conditions, the work was slow. The women had to break the rocks up into smaller pieces so that steps could be made for the staircase, and the men would haul their heavily laden baskets up to continue the work. Very often, one of them would fall, hurtling down on top of others making their way up. My aunt endured the harsh treatment that she and the other women suffered for a year, only playing her violin in the barracks at night, which helped keep their spirits up. In the winter of 1939, she and many others were rounded up once again, herded into trucks and sent to Auschwitz, which had now been designated as a concentration camp. Her violin was still in her possession, and she had it with her when she was taken to be registered. She was asked her name, age, and where she was from. On being told she was English, a woman officer called Irma Gresser asked why she was in Germany. Rosa told her she had been with the Berlin Philharmonic from 1936 until her arrest, which Gresser did not believe, and screamed vile insults at her, calling her a filthy Jew. She then walked away, taking Rosa's violin with her as she left the room. Rosa was devastated and thought she would never see it again. She then suffered the degradation of having numbers tattooed on her arm, her head shaved, and having her own clothes replaced with a striped uniform. She and 3 other girls, all musicians, were then taken by the Blockova, a female guard, to one of the huts in a huge compound. What they saw on the way was beyond belief. And when it came to food being distributed, she could not comprehend at first how human beings could stoop so low. It did not take long for her to join those ranks. After a few days, she and the other 3 girls were summoned by the Blockova and taken to another hut where music could be heard playing. When they entered, they found several women sitting in a circle playing a variety of instruments, and Irma Gresser standing with a violin case in her hand. She passed this to my aunt and said this was her violin. My aunt opened it and was overjoyed to find it was indeed hers, the very same one my grandfather had brought from Russia. She had thought it was lost to her forever. It was very quickly established that all the women were competent musicians, and they were allowed to rehearse for an hour each day, on many occasions giving recitals in the evenings to the officers, including Hoss, Taub, Gresser, and Mengele, Dr. Death as he became known. This meant they received slightly better food and living conditions and were not worked to death. When they were not rehearsing, my aunt was employed in one of the clothing huts, examining clothes for hidden jewellery and money, often finding rings and loose stones sewn into the seams of garments, which were immediately handed over to the soldiers. One day she was taken by the block of her to a smart house on the outskirts of the camp. To her amazement and joy, she was given a hot bath, which enabled her to get rid of most of the lice which infested her body and encased her scalp. Then she had a meal, a real meal, but didn't understand why. It soon became obvious to her when she was given a dressing gown and no other clothes, and taken to Commandant Huss's room. She was to be used as his plaything. This went on for many weeks, and after she had been used by him, she had to play his choice of music on her violin until he stopped her. He would sit with his eyes closed, listening to the music, finally dismissing her when he had heard enough. Although this was degradation in the worst possible way, it meant that Rosa began to put on weight. Her hair began to grow, and the boils and ulcers on her body disappeared, and she was still alive. When the trucks arrived at the railway sidings each day with hundreds of men, women, and children on board, the orchestra was sent to play rousing music to greet them, which was supposed to placate these people into thinking they had arrived at the resettlement camp they had been promised and paid for when they boarded the trucks. The orchestra knew the fate of all these people, most of whom were destined to die, but could do nothing to help them. Instead, they had to watch the chimneys belch their smoke into the sky and smell the acrid stench which pervaded the air. One day, when their hut was called for the usual roll call and they were all lined up, Gresser and Hoss, together with Mengele, strolled down the line of women, Mengele pointing with his stick, first at one and then at another. He came to Rosa and asked if she was one of the violin players in the orchestra. Rosa nodded. And he said to Gresser that he wanted her over at his hospital. My aunt was taken there later that day, where she was anaesthetized and experimented on. She remained in the hospital for some weeks, witnessing several other atrocities. On her release, she returned to play in the orchestra, welcoming the ever-increasing trains arriving daily and sorting the piles of clothes which grew and grew as more people arrived. It was well known by all the inmates that people were being put to death in their thousands. She was no longer being used by Hoss, so her health quickly deteriorated again. The lice returned and she rapidly lost weight. Then the rumors began. The Russians were on their way. It was January 1945, bitterly cold and heavy snow was falling. All around the camp were piles of skeletons, and the chimneys continued to belch smoke constantly day and night. The orchestra were told to gather up their instruments and take what music they could carry and line up outside the music hut. Although many members had died during the 5 years, new arrivals had replaced them, so there were still about a dozen of them. Rosa and her companions, together with some people still alive in the compounds, were put into cattle trucks and the train set off. It was the middle of winter and all they wore were their striped tunics. So despite huddling together for warmth, several of them died. When the train reached its destination, only a few hundred in all the trucks had survived the journey. They had come to Belsen. Conditions here were worse than Auschwitz, if that was possible, but the orchestra were again forced to play for the officers and to welcome the trains which still continued to arrive every day. In April 1945, Belgium was liberated by the Americans and English. They were free, and my aunt could now fulfill her wish to tell the world of the atrocities which the Germans had committed. She was so ill, it was early June before she could be moved from the camp and taken to a hospital run by the British, remaining there for several months before giving evidence for the Nuremberg trials. After about a year, she was sent to a convalescent home in England, suffering from TB, and finally sent home to Leeds in 1947. She died at the end of that year, but not before telling my father and I what she and thousands of others had suffered. On her death, my father was given her violin, which he played almost daily. He was declared medically unfit and could not become an enlisted soldier when he was called up in 1939 because of his badly damaged feet, caused by walking without shoes on the long trek across Russia as a child. So he became an established member of ENSA during the war, together with such famous names as Vic Oliver, Harry Roy, Billy Cotton, Vera Lynn, Gracie Fields, and many other famous names. His band entertained the troops here and overseas, and he made many radio broadcasts, notably Workers' Playtime, Henry Hall's Guest Night, and dozens more during those long years. After the war, he formed several of his own bands, which played on the radio, in the Dorchester and Mayfair London hotels, and many seaside towns during the summer months. On his death in 1985, the violin was given to me, but was never played until its total restoration by John Dilworth, a famous violin maker, for the programme The Repair Shop, which was shown on BBC Two in March 2018 and has been repeated many times since that date. He discovered the violin was made in 1883 in Dresden, Germany, from the school of Guarnerius. So it is probable that my grandfather was the first owner. He stressed that the violin should be played regularly, and because no one in the family plays, it has now been donated for perpetuity to the Yehuda Menuhin School in memory of my aunt and father. It was originally played regularly by an 18-year-old boy from Taiwan who won a scholarship to the school and is highly talented, but he has now graduated and is in Vienna training to be a conductor. The next student, a young lady, graduated to the Royal Academy last September, and now the violin is being played by another young man who happens to be half Russian, which gives me a great deal of pleasure, as this seems most fitting. Passing the fiddle on to various students at the school ensures the instrument stays alive for another 100 years. As a result of the TV programme in March 2018, I was contacted by a publisher who agreed to publish the book, and it was released in May of that year. I was immediately asked to give talks, particularly to the Holocaust Survivors Centre in London, and others then quickly followed. And as I was invited to be a presenter at the Limud conference that December with over 300 attendees at many synagogues in Birmingham and London, on P&O and Princess cruise lines, local libraries, Rotary groups, Women's Institute meetings, and many private groups. Shortly after publication, a well-known film producer called me to say that he'd been sent a copy, and on reading it, could not put it down. The result is I have now signed a contract with him, and he hopes to make the story of the fiddle into a major TV series. But of course, this will probably take several years to come to fruition. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Very intrigued. And I know, John, you're going to handle the questions. May I be the first to ask a question?
Yeah, just before you do that, Simon, absolutely, yes, it would be great. I'm sure you've got a lot of, thoughts about this, and maybe some other people have as well. But just before we do that, Simon, I'll take your question as first one. What I wanted to say was, I hope that you all have enjoyed that incredible story, and it is an incredible story by any stretch of imagination. Natalie and I have been around, and we've done maybe 12 or 14 of these talks together. And what we tend to do is we play the fiddle, she then does her talk, and at the end of her talk, out comes a young student with the actual violin. And that, I have to tell you, is the most moving and incredible experience. You can hear a pin drop. People often have tears in their eyes, particularly me, it has to be said, when I hear this violin, because that is the actual violin that went through that history from 1893. That 50 years of that history in the 20th century, and not a particularly good century for us as human beings, it has to be said. So it's really moving when you hear that violin, and particularly seeing a young person playing it. And then I would run the Q&A. So why did I was given the book by a friend of mine who read it, and he said, I think you would like this. I think there's something here. He was very, very moved by it. I read the book. I got in touch with Natalie, and I said, look, this is going to be a huge job to make something like this, because this is not a documentary I want to make. This is a television drama that in for my vision of it, I would be one of the producers on it. I'm a director myself, but I wouldn't direct it. It's a big TV drama, a big tentpole drama spanning about 8 or 10 hours. So it would be 10 one-hour episodes, for instance. And I have a vision for it on something like Netflix or Amazon or one of the streamers now, which as you all know, have become very popular, in particular during the pandemic. And it would be a huge budget. It would be somewhere in the region of $80 to $100 million. You'd need about $10 million because you have to recreate everything. And what I'm trying to do is I'm out looking for development money, essentially, because in order to even get this anywhere near a streamer like Netflix, you have to present them with a script, and it has to be a really good script, first draft script. And to get a really good first draft script from any writer worth his or her salt, you're looking at about $250,000, something like that, maybe more. So that's what I'm trying to do. So, and I have to do that. I've got a pitch document that I send to people. I'm talking to people all the time, and I'm trying to raise this initial development money in order to be able to get this story told, because I believe it's a story that needs to be told and retold. And in particular, we follow the violin from 1917 in St. Petersburg right the way through to about 1967 when Natalie's father had it. So it's a big vision, and for me, we'll get to know the characters in the journey. We'll see the violin all the way through, and in particular the grueling part of the history of the violin when Rose is in the death camps. So that's what I want to do. It's a huge job. It's a huge undertaking, but I'm determined to get it made. And Natalie, I have to say, has been absolutely fantastic. She says she's 83. She's got the energy of somebody 30 years younger. She's very enthusiastic. She goes around all over the place. And we're delighted to be able to come here this evening and present to you. So somebody may be sitting here and thinking, I know somebody who can help this guy. If you can, get in touch with Evelyn or Evelyn, who is for tonight called Sophie, but on the screen, or indeed with Simon as well. So you may be able to help or do something, I don't know. Anyway, without further ado, we will run a Q&A, and we'll begin with Simon, and hopefully you'll have some interesting questions which Natalie will endeavour to answer. So thank you very much once again, Simon, for hosting, and you, Evelyn, all your work. And I'll hand it over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time has been running on, and we usually really like to try and make it an hour. So we really only have about 10 minutes, in fairness to everyone, I think. A very quick, easy, I think an easy sort of a question. Natalie is clearly Natalia, born in October 1937, and the daughter of Israel and the niece of Rosa. And my question is, how come, Natalie, that your dad did not teach you the violin? Because my goodness, violin playing in your family is at a level that has been remarkable. So I presume there must have been some big reason.
Because I was put in a boarding school at the age of 4 until I was 15, whilst my mother and father were abroad in Ensa. I learned to play the piano, and I used to, when I stopped being a boarder and went into my late teens, we would play duets, but we certainly didn't have a violin teacher at my school. So that's why I never learned the violin.
I feel sorry for you because, my God, you had teachers available.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yes.
Right. Okay, back to you, John.
Thank you very much, Simon. So has anybody got a question for Natalie? You can just click off your mute button and ask her a question. Any question at all, I'm sure she will be delighted to answer. Jill.
Hi, pleased to meet you. My name's Jill Simpson. I'm a violinist from Scotland, and I have a big interest in the Women's Orchestra at Auschwitz, and I research quite a lot on this. Is this book loosely based on the truth?
Well, yes, it's based on truth as far as my recollection of everything that she told me as a 9-10-year-old girl. I was very fortunate that I remembered a lot of it, and when I went back to school in the autumn, we had a history teacher, and she said, as most of these teachers do, write down what you did in your school holidays. I wrote down what I had done and what my aunt had told me, in very childish terms, of course, and she latched onto this and said, let's get more of this. And in fact, she did do quite a lot with me on that. And then when I was 15, 16, went home, my father and I would talk about it. He remembered vividly many of the occasions that are mentioned in the book, things like the igloo making and going to the cave with the shepherds, which, unless you read the book, you probably wouldn't know about them.
I've read the book, yeah.
So he you know, oh, you got it there. So he remembered these incidents, but of course there's things in there to embellish the book. But yes, it's based on fact.
Yeah, it's just there's a few historical points from a violinist point of view, the Berlin Philharmonic. Women were not in the Berlin Philharmonic until 1982. I'm not quite sure where that information came from, Natalie, because most of the Jewish musicians had Furtwängler actually made sure they were gone in 1935. So there was no actually Jewish musicians in the Berlin Philharmonic. So just some of the historical facts as a violinist.
That I can't answer that. Maybe it wasn't the Berlin Philharmonic, maybe it was another, but I, as a girl anyway, that's what I was told. It was a Philharmonic orchestra. Yeah, some of it has to be embellished, but
yeah, because the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra actually started in 1948, and I don't think Matthaus and the women weren't actually taken there till 1944. It's just because I have a great interest in the women's orchestra at Auschwitz, so it's just some of the. But I realised you were only 9 years old, and listening to this story. So it's just, as a violinist, I'm very interested in the book, but I just wondered if it was loosely based on the truth, because just historically, you know, for example, there's nothing mentioned about Alma Rosie in the book. And
About
of course,
who? Sorry?
Alma Rosie in the book, and she was the great conductor of the ladies' orchestra in Auschwitz.
Yes, and there was another woman who I believe is still alive, who was also in the women's orchestra.
Anita Walfish.
Anita
She's
Walfish.
98
Yes,
now.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
she's
but I
98.
mean,
Yeah.
I wasn't told about any names of anybody, you know, as I say, if I was, it was never, I was never able to remember that.
Yeah.
I just have to say that it was based on what I was told, and my father and I decided that we ought to have it as a family record, and it wasn't until much, much later on in life, really more when he was much older, in his late 70s, that we decided, or I decided, I ought to put this into a form of a book, which was rejected many, many times until it was finally published.
What I
did
would say about, sorry, go on, Jill.
Sorry. No, I was just wondering if she went into the camp with her Russian name. I mean, I know by the book she was in under her British name, so I can't. It's difficult to find her, you know. It's difficult
That's
to
something
find.
that's something we'll never know. We don't know whether, unfortunately, my father never took down the numbers that she had on her arm. That's the one thing that he regretted all the time. He said, I wish I'd had her numbers so that we could trace her. So we don't know whether she was using a stage name, whether she'd become naturalized British, or whether she was still Russian. I only say in the book, on telling Irma Gresser she was British, just as part of the story. I mean, I could have said if she'd, my feeling is that if she'd said she was Russian, that she would have probably felt that she was in great danger, or much more danger, because of the relationship between the Germans and the Russians. But again, this is sort of part of the story. This is me writing down.
Yeah,
what
there were a lot of Russians actually in the orchestra, because the orchestra only ran from 1943 to 44. It was quite a small portion of the camp that the you know, it actually ran. But I'll go back to all my names and look at the names.
Jill, if I may just jump in here, it might be useful for us to exchange numbers, because you obviously know quite a lot. And as a musician and as somebody who's interested in history, very good. But what I would say is this, I make drama. I made a movie about the Catholic Church, which won lots of awards, this, that, and the other. And I interviewed priests in the UK, interviewed priests in Ireland, interviewed priests in Italy. And what we had to put on the front of the film for legal reasons was inspired by true events, as opposed to based on true events. There's a legal distinction. And what we would do with this, because it is, the history is a bit blurred. You know, you can have people seeing an accident 3 months ago and they all see different things in an accident, you know, let alone 70 years ago or something. So what we would do is, the way we would work it is, there would be researchers. There are people who can find out all this. They can find it, because Rosa gave evidence in Nuremberg. So there will be a record of that somewhere. And it's a question of finding that, and also the number and all that.
Can I suggest?
Yeah.
I suggest it'll be very easy for me to make an inquiry at Yad Vashem, who are absolutely the supreme authority in tracing. And of course, different names, they have records of about 7 million. And of course, there weren't 7 million. And that 7 million really is about 4.8 million. But just because of the confusion between the way names are spelt, pronounced, and so on. But I think the greatest chance of getting some background on Rosa in particular will be through making the inquiry. It will take a little time because they have so much to do, but I'm very happy. So
that would be fantastic, Simon, I think.
I'm very happy to attempt to research and find out more. Yeah,
that would be wonderful. I think that would be really good, because I would like to get this right, and we'd have to get it right for a number of reasons. First of all, if you don't get it right, there will be somebody who will say that wasn't right, and there can be a storm about something that's relatively trivia, and not looking at the bigger picture, because people want to you know, throw the dead cat onto the table type thing and distract from it. So I would want that. So any help with that would be really good. So yeah, so let's exchange numbers, Jill and Simon. Well, Evelyn's got one number.
Could you interchange the contact details?
Yeah, we can do it on chat here. I can do it on chat in a second.
Okay, fine, good idea.
Okay.
So
I'm conscious of time, John. So, and I don't want to impose on too many people. I know, Julian, I know you had a serious question, although I think to a degree, I think, was it Eve? Please forgive me, I've forgotten your name for a second. Jill, sorry.
Yes, it was a similar question.
Asked your question in a form.
yeah, anybody got any other questions?
My only question to Natalie was similar to Jill's, but it related to the telling of her grandfather's story in Russia. And the eye for detail to me was staggering, and it was almost like a verbatim account. I just wondered how much of that was handed down by way of family archival story and how much was embellished, as I think you said.
Are you the gentleman that sent me the email?
I did put a question in earlier on. In fact, I was delighted to meet you a few weeks ago when you spoke publicly and you read from your book, and I've now since read it. So it was very interesting, and thank you.
Obviously, they fled from St. Petersburg with a handcart, and that was told to me by my aunt and my father. They remembered it vividly as 6-year-old children, 5- and 6-year-old children, and they remembered explicitly the conditions, the winter, the igloo, making the igloo, the reindeers. I mean, I remember as a 5-year-old in the book, if you've read it, when my bicycle brakes failed on the hill with my father. Yes. I remember that as if that was yesterday. Yes. So I think children of 6 and 7 are well able to recall incidents that really stuck in their mind at the time.
Right.
And I mean, certainly the business when my father was called up in 1939, for instance, his feet were like a sponge underneath. They were dreadful. And he used to have to tend them regularly with permanganate of potash. Even as a 40, 50, 60-year-old man, they were always very badly damaged. So I had to write down as he remembered it, and as I was told, as the previous person said, you know, you can remember certain things, but not everything.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
May I ask a question at this stage? I wonder, Natalie, if you were aware that in Tel Aviv, there's a man who has almost created a small museum of violins that were saved or survived. In fact, I think they're called the survivors of the war. And he came to England with several of those violins a few years ago and played at City Hall for Holocaust Memorial Day. And I wondered if at any time you had ever considered, before you gave you donated the violin to the Yehudi Menu in school, to liaise with them or link with them, and that might be helpful for you, John, as well, to get some of the information that emanates from there.
Well, I gave it to, I know the organization you are referring to, because I met someone from there at the Limud conference in 2018 when I was there, and it was a woman, and she made herself known to me, and she was part of that museum. And they didn't just have violins, they did have some other instruments as well, but in the main they were strings, probably because they were easier to carry, I suppose. But the reason really for giving it to the Yehudi Menuhin School was that it was going to stay in England, but I knew that it would be played regularly, as John Dilworth said in the film, it would be played daily, whereas in a museum, it would only just be taken out and played on odd occasions.
Yeah. I get that. And could I just mention to Jill, en passant, as they say, I seem to remember that there was a violin played by Fania Fanelon. There's a story about that as well, as part of the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra.
Right, yeah. Fania Fanelon, she was one of the singers in the orchestra.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was French, yeah.
French or Belgian, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, French, yeah, that's right, yeah.
Wasn't she played by Vanessa Redgrave on the
She was playing for
She was, yes.
Yes.
Playing for Time, that's
Yeah.
right.
Playing for, that's the one. In fact, the book is called Playing for Time.
Playing for Time, that's right.
So over to you, Simon.
I think it's time a very big thank you, Natalie, and a very big thank you, John. Intriguing. I put my email address up, so if you'd like to pursue my attempting to find out more on the basis, John, you just spoke about and that Jill, you have flagged up with Yad Vashem, I will be very happy to. I'd just like to advise everyone attending our next book that we're going to be reviewing, which is going to be on the 21st of June, is a book called Aftermath by Harold Jarner, who's a German journalist. Just to read you one out of many tributes, because it's a book that's been really lauded very widely, but one from the Publishers Weekly. Germans rebounded from shattering defeat with hard work, a pragmatic embrace of the new, and a willful forgetting of trauma and guilt, according to this penetrating history of the early post-war period. Elegantly written and translated, Jarner's analysis deploys emotional, resonant detail to vividly recreate a vibrant, if morally haunted, historical watershed. This eye-opening study enthralls. It won a Pulitzer Prize. It's a fantastic book. So we'll be reviewing that on the 21st of June, and we will find somebody appropriate to be facilitating the discussion. And of course, all of you are hugely welcome, and we will be writing to all in our database to invite them to attend. So real final, thank you very, very much.